Hello and welcome to Sustainapod, the podcast produced by young people for young people about the world of sustainability. We talk with leading professionals and changemakers about what it takes to build a more sustainable present and future, sharing the stories, tips, and insights for you to take action. My name is Scarlett, and today I'll be co-hosting this episode with Bernice. There has never been a more important time than now to speak about the issue of hunger. Our world is currently experiencing a food crisis. Around 309 million people are facing chronic hunger globally, and 1.1 million people are on the brink of famine, particularly in Gaza, South Sudan, and Mali. 70% of the world's hungry people are living in areas burdened by war and violence. It is clear that conflict is the biggest driver of hunger.
We are thrilled to have Rebecca Richards with us today to talk about this topic. Rebecca is currently the lead of the World Food Programme's Global Network Against Food Crises, an alliance of humanitarian and development actors tackling global food crises and promoting sustainable solutions. She has over 23 years of experience working at the nexus of humanitarian response, peacekeeping, and emergency coordination. There's really no better person to deep dive into the topic of peace and conflict resolution and its importance for tackling the global food crisis than Rebecca. Thank you, Rebecca, for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you on Sustainapod.
Thanks, Bernice. It's wonderful to be here and lovely to meet you both. I'm excited.
So, first of all, to start, could we ask what inspired you to pursue a career in the UN and in food security?
Sure. So I'm born in London, but my parents are from Sri Lanka. So my roots are from Asia, and that is very much what framed my desire to join the UN, because Sri Lanka is a country very beautiful, known as the Pearl in the Indian Ocean. And unfortunately, it's been riddled with conflict for many, many years for various reasons. And so that has really influenced why I wanted to join the UN. I was primarily interested in conflict. And as I got to gain my experience in different countries where I worked, I started to see how food and food security impacted people's lives and how, with or without it, you can either make conflict worse or conflict better.
Yeah, that's so true. Food itself is one of the most basic things, right? And without it, it can just descend into chaos. So you've been on the front line for so many crises in your career, like the 2000 Afghanistan crisis, the Pakistan earthquake and floods, and the Cyclone Nargis response in Myanmar, and the Somalia crisis. So what has been your most memorable experience and why?
So, Bernice, there are so many things because they're so different, but I'm going to name a couple if you let me. But the one that stands out in my mind the most is Afghanistan. So, Afghanistan was my first real experience. I moved to Pakistan when I was 23 to work for the UN Special Representative for the Secretary General on Afghanistan. The office was based out of the country next door. We were in Islamabad. And I worked for the political office. So the start of my career was really around supporting the Special Representative's office and all of his officers. I was very junior in their negotiations with the Taliban. So after 9/11, things got pretty difficult in the country, and you'll remember how that really changed the course of history for everybody. And all the attention of the world suddenly shifted towards Afghanistan. And I was one of a very small team that was asked to support the Bonn Peace Accords. So the Bonn Peace Accords are basically the United Nations brokered a peace agreement for Afghanistan, and that took place in Germany in the city of Bonn. It was about 10 days, 2 weeks. All of the different tribal organizations, leaders in Afghanistan that make up the governance structure were brought to Germany, and the United Nations basically fostered a conversation that set up a new governance structure for Afghanistan with the member states and those Western countries who were supporting it. And I was lucky enough to be part of that team and to be in Bonn for that week. And I saw how amazing it is when you come to an agreement. I saw all the differences between tribes and interests. I saw the power of the United Nations in multilateralism and really trying to bring peace without there having to be war. And that, for me, has been a huge mark on my thinking, on who I stand for, what I stand for, and it has shaped my career.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting that you say that, because a lot of the time on the media, when I see news about different countries and the agreements, it's often portrayed quite negatively. So it's really nice to see that there's actually a lot of agreement and positive coming out of this. So, going into the issue of the food crisis, there's actually a global food surplus for the first time in human history. And with current technologies, we could feed up to 10 billion people on the planet, but there are still 690 million people that remain malnourished. Why is that?
So there are three main reasons, Scarlett, for why you have this contradiction, right? A huge contradiction. It doesn't make a lot of sense. Number one is access. So when I talk about access, I'm talking about people's ability to access food and our ability to access people with food. So two things. And the reason I frame it like that is because there are several reasons why people can't access food and why their hunger depreciates, and then you get to the situation where, as you said right at the beginning, there are almost 1.1 million people at risk of famine or in famine today. And that's incredible, for a world that as modern as ours, where we have the technology, we have all the infrastructure, it doesn't make any sense. And you see it in Hong Kong, I see it in London. I'm here in Ecuador at the moment, and I live outside the city of Quito. It is a beautiful place where you only have to drop a seed and it's going to grow. It's not the desert, it's not difficult to produce food. The problem becomes availability, access, and the ability to be able to move food and get it to people. As we say within the UN system, from farm to fork. Now, one of the reasons why, as you've already mentioned, that doesn't happen is because of conflict. And you see, when it comes to conflict, it's actually over time a deliberate tactic used in war. Did you know that? That if you want to win a war, the first thing you do is cut off the supply lines to the place you want to take. If you go back into biblical times or even over history, if you besiege a city and cut off the supply chain into that city for food, you're going to more likely be able to take the city, right? So it's very much a tactic of war. It's the way that you approach war if you want to win or if you want to lose. So that's something to think about. The second is that we have seen a significant change over time because of climate change. So much more weather-related shocks on our countries. Now, whether that was, I think it was 2003, and this was probably one of a huge experience for me, but the tsunamis in Asia affected Sri Lanka, Indonesia. It was pretty big, right? A lot of people were affected, and from one day you wake up and your whole livelihood, your home is washed away and you have nowhere to go, right? You're displaced, you start over, there are no schools, but also your food your food security has completely gone. You're really thinking about how am I going to feed my family? So weather-related shocks, and that includes also drought, right? Because in many of the countries that we work in, we're able to predict and know when drought is going to come, how bad it's going to get, and you adjust the way that you plant your seeds. Now, when those get worse and worse, and your crops are completely damaged or they just don't take hold, you can't feed your family. And again, it's another situation. So weather-related shocks. Now, the third one is economic shocks. And by economic shocks, I mean when the price of food gets so high, you can't afford to buy it. And we've seen this even during COVID. Can you remember when the cost of bread in most of our countries almost doubled, right? Now, we make ends meet. There are protection mechanisms, social protection mechanisms in our countries that can support families. But in some of the most fragile countries, they don't have that support. So when the price of food jumps for various reasons, more recently, the Ukraine war, right? Because of the situation with Russia and the ability to export agricultural products and fertilizer, the cost of food globally went up. It was a real shock to the system. And so that then has a knock-on effect, and people are not able to buy food and they start to turn to different things. They move in search of food, or they take on different types of work. They pull their kids out of school, and it becomes a very dangerous and more difficult way to live. So, three reasons why shocks are responsible for the fact that we have so many people hungry today. But I should add that underlying those, so when I talk about the shocks, those are things that exacerbate and make things worse. But underlying the shocks is something that we call structural causes or root causes of hunger. And if you look at the reasons why a country cannot feed its own people, it is mainly due to the governance around the institutions responsible for people's access to food. Now, what do I mean by that? I know that sounds a little bit technical, but I'm talking about the ministries and those sort of governance structures, political structures within a country that allow people to buy food, allow people to be part of a social protection mechanism, allow food to reach markets and come into the supermarket shelves. All of that requires a process in a country, and that's governed by different policies, laws, so on and so forth. So that's where the problem starts, is when those pieces don't work.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because I didn't really think about like all the different factors that went into it, like all the government policies and structures that manage food distribution and the prices as well that would affect people's ability to access food. So, kind of tying into that, we know that the UN has introduced humanitarian reform, which is a way to kind of improve the situation. And could you explain why this would be important to achieve food security?
Sure. So, reform in any sense of the word, Scarlett, so not just humanitarian reform, but system reform is something that we should always be trying to do. So, when we say reform, we're talking about trying to change the way we do things to make it better, right? And humanitarian reform is actually today attached to a new set of policies on how to deliver humanitarian assistance that happened after the tsunami. So during the tsunami, everybody wanted to help. Like, it was the front page of the news. You'll remember we were all trying to send clothes, send food, put money into organizations that we feel could reach people and our loved ones. It was chaotic. There was no organization. So just to simplify, back in 2005, 6, 7, we put in place a humanitarian reform system that put order into how you deliver humanitarian assistance. So, for example, we grouped it around themes. There's shelter. Everybody working on shelter had to coordinate so that you didn't have people going off doing different things, and you really tried to structure your response in a way that you could meet the needs of people, right? And not that in one part of the country or in one country you had so much and in another you had nothing. Other themes were water and sanitation, right? Because when you look, food security in particular is reliant on clean water, but being able to ensure that populations in need had access to water and to right levels of sanitation, because when they don't, disease becomes a whole other issue that we have to deal with. What are our other sectors? Food security. Logistics. WFP, I'm so proud to work for WFP since 2008. That's now almost half of my career, actually just over half, 2/3 of my career has been with WFP, the World Food Programme. And we also have a massive supply chain. There's a reason why we're the largest humanitarian organization in the world. It's because we have a large supply chain. So logistics and moving goods is another theme they coordinate around. So that's, Scarlett, was the reform, humanitarian reform that took place off the back of the tsunami. Now we're looking and we're starting to look at a more system-wide reform, and the UN's always trying to do better. And the main reason for that is to gain efficiencies, to be better coordinated, and to use the funds that we have in a more effective way to support people in need.
Right. You've mentioned how there are all these different sectors, and as the World Food Program, you have all these different outreaches, these different connections, different food supply chains. But with so many conflicts going on right now, so many food crises all around in the world, like Gaza or Sudan or Haiti, how does the World Food Program make the decision of where these resources will go, where these food supplies will go?
That's a really tough one, Bernice. WFP is 100% voluntarily funded. So we have to raise our money. And the way we do it is we bring the realities of who is in need and their situations to the world through our reports, through the reports that you quoted at the beginning of the podcast, right? Now, there's not enough resources to get to everybody, as you said. So how do we take the decisions? We take the decisions first and foremost based on people's needs, right? Who's the worst off? Who do we need to get to first? Who's on that brink of famine and starvation? We need to pull them back. That's number one. We also take decisions around those that have given us the funding, because many organizations, many member states say, look, we're giving you this money, but we really need you to spend it here or there. So sometimes our choices are already factored into where we go, right? And who we need to reach. And the third thing I would say is, as an organization, I'm very proud of this piece. We never give up advocating to get to everybody, right? And sometimes it's very tough. And I have seen in many of our countries, and especially the countries I've worked, you have to decide, do you give everybody a little bit less when you don't have enough money? Or do you give less people the full amount? And food security is a tough one, because you and I know that we need a certain calorific intake for your daily needs, for your energy. So when you start to give less, people do suffer. But you want to make sure that that giving and that support doesn't exacerbate tensions. Because as we've seen, if you remember when you're reading the Arab Spring, when the cost of bread went so high in Egypt and people couldn't buy food, it results in tensions. It results in violence. So you have to take all of those issues into account when you decide who receives food. And you have to make sure you have an open and transparent ongoing conversation with the member states and the countries you work, so they understand what's going to happen when it's less, and what's going to happen when you're forced to make these choices. And if we are going to only feed one population and not the other, what are the repercussions, especially on the children and the mothers and those who bear the greatest brunt? So it's a tough one.
Yeah. So after this long process of deciding where to allocate the food, what's the process of actually providing and distributing the food to the countries for conflict and emergency situations?
So first step is understanding who needs food, right? So the first step is always a real detailed and a consensus understanding of the needs of populations. And once you've got that, and for us, it's very clear WFP is in the toughest places and in the places where the hunger levels are the highest. And those are mostly conflict countries. They're not all conflict countries, but they're conflict countries. Now, in these countries, Scarlett, Bernice, we have to, first and foremost, have the permission of the government or be invited by the government to come in and help. Right? Many countries don't want external assistance, and they don't want anyone interfering in their internal politics, for example. But first you have to be invited and you have to be requested to support. And then once we do, that's when we look at the situation and we decide, are markets functional? And if markets are functional, we really try to support people through the delivery of cash. Cash allows them to make their own choices, allows them to spread the resources they have in a way that supports their family, because people knows best how to look after their own families, right? And that also then keeps markets alive and keeps the local economy functional, which is really important. You don't want to go in and leave a country in a worse off condition than when you arrived. So we start with that real focus on supporting the country. In many of our countries, however, and you'll see this from the news, markets are not functional and conflict has got so bad that you need to physically bring food in. And that's when our supply chain kicks in. And that requires, especially in conflict settings, permission to move trucks, searching of our trucks to check that that's exactly what we're moving and not anything else. There's a level of scrutiny that's quite tough, a lot of monitoring, because food inside a conflict area can not end up in people's hands. And we have to be very careful about that. So it's a tough one. If you look at South Sudan, we fly in our food and sometimes have to drop our food where people can come and get it. In many of our Asian countries, we're using, and even here in Ecuador, we're using boats because it's overseas. If I remember my time in the Middle East, that was a little bit more sophisticated and we had that combination of cash. So you could upload a voucher onto a telephone, right? And then with the telephone, you can go to a shop and claim your food. And that's automatic, without even having to move anything. You could do it all from the computer. So we've got a range of tools now where we can provide cash and vouchers and physically move food depending on the situation of the country.
Right, that's interesting how you mentioned there are these different ways of helping a country and maybe on different levels too, whether it's nationwide or targeting individuals. But the cash thing was interesting too, as in you give this resource that they can spend in their own way, right? So it isn't you're providing them with this one thing. They can meet their own needs.
That's right. And it's more dignified, It's much more dignified for a family. And nobody wants to be given food. You want to be able to go into a shop and be like everybody else. And when I worked in Jordan and I went to our local supermarket, Carrefour, I was lining up along with all our Syrian refugees who were also receiving food through our vouchers on their phone. And you couldn't tell the difference. And that was great because it allowed them to become part of society and to look after their families. And it built a level of, I would say, social cohesion through the way that we provided
Exactly, and they're the ones in control.
Cash for food.
The thing is, about providing all these resources to all these people, there are definitely many challenges when it comes to providing resources to conflict regions, as in maybe there might be certain limitations or you might not be able to access certain areas, such as in the Gaza Strip. So how does the WFP kind of work around these obstacles?
So we're very much part of a system, Bernice. So WFP is part of a group of agencies who are all trying to reach people. And we have a structure in every country, a coordination platform, and it's coordinated by a resident humanitarian coordinator. And through that system, we negotiate with both sides of a conflict or with those who are involved with the conflict, asking for permissions, proposing options, ensuring that we are neutral, that we are impartial, that we are principled in our approach. And that then influences what we can and can't do, right? So this is where we go back to that situation where food security is really intrinsically linked with peace. And you'll remember that I think our proudest moment was when WFP received the Nobel Peace Prize a couple of years ago now. And that's because of that recognition. I should also remember that the UN Security Council passed a resolution. This is something you guys should take a look at. A resolution, the number is 2417, and it's on conflict and hunger. And it outlines how we need to have the support to get to people in conflict settings. I won't go into all the details now, but food security and that negotiation and ensuring your neutrality and impartiality is the first step towards being allowed to operate in a conflict country, right? But you have to negotiate access. Access is something that a warring side can give you for one day or could give you regularly, depending on how you deliver assistance. So that coordination effort and that negotiation for access is a prerequisite for us to be able to reach people. It's kind of complicated because in many of the countries we work, there are different parties to the conflict, and you've got to be able to build and maintain a relationship with everybody because of our neutrality, because of our impartiality, and because we are a humanitarian organization. So our whole objective is to ensure that everybody that needs food assistance can get it. And that's regardless of where the conflict is and conflict lines.
Yeah, so you mentioned that it's really important to be impartial and stay neutral in order to gain access and to be able to help these countries that are in conflict. So we're now moving on to the last section. So Bernice and I guess we're both quite lucky to have never experienced extreme hunger. And we were wondering what we could do and other listeners could do to raise awareness of this global issue in areas like Hong Kong, where we live, where the issue of hunger might not be as apparent.
Well, the first place that it starts is in the schools. So I would really focus on looking at the education side of things. It's fantastic. It makes a big difference. Even small things that you do can elevate the knowledge of global hunger. We have a lot of resources that we can share with you, but putting it into a curricula so that other students are aware is the first step. Here in Ecuador, we did something a little fun where in the school where my children are at, we asked them to come up with nutritional recipes because nutrition and malnutrition here is a really big deal in Ecuador. And so the family sent in different recipes, and the WFP nutritionists selected those that were of the best nutritional value. And we worked with the teachers in the school and put it into a book. And in the book, it also talked about global hunger and hunger in Ecuador, so that when you're looking at the recipes, you're learning a little bit, right, as you go through. And they then ran sessions throughout the school to help kids understand the different levels of hunger and nutrition. So that was kind of a fun way to start because kids at the age of, for me, my son is 8, my daughter is 10, they are learning all the time, and you've got to help them understand first about hunger and nutrition and then what it means at a global level. So I would start with schools. That's great. Advocacy work like what you're doing now, being able to talk about it and share information is brilliant. But what I have found is that within each country, depending on the country, you're less aware of what's happening outside of your country. So bringing that knowledge in, I would think about social media. It's very powerful these days, and bringing snippets and making it accessible, translating it. We got to do better at translation, I feel, because apart from the 6 official languages of the UN, we want to make sure that all our literature and information is translated into local languages, into local dialects, so that everyone can read, can understand. That's a huge step forward. So maybe think about those things and use our knowledge base, the World Food Programme's website, but also the support that you find from the Global Network Against Food Crisis website. It's called fightfoodcrisis.net. And there's a lot of information there. And I'm really happy to connect you to our teams to get some ideas of some of the things that have been done in other countries to raise awareness.
Right. I really agree with your point of starting from a young age, as in this kind of awareness of the global issues and like these issues that other people are facing has to be fostered from a really young age. Like what we're doing right now, we've learned about it. So then now we're doing something about it. So last but not least, what's one piece of advice that you give to young people who are hoping to do something to contribute to this cause of alleviating hunger?
My one piece of advice would be that while this is a huge issue and the numbers are really, really daunting, and we're talking about millions, right? But for the young people who are interested in supporting, every little counts. I think that's my advice. Every tiny action, every little contribution. And contribution, I mean, Bernice, for me, that's knowledge. You know, just learning about it and thinking about how do I put this into practice in my daily life is the first step forward. And that's what really counts. Don't get daunted by the big numbers. It's the small actions of every single person all together that makes a difference.
Person on this planet did something that could make a huge impact. So just wrapping it up then, thank you so much to Rebecca for joining Scarlett and me today on this very special episode and sharing all your really amazing insights. And thank you to Sustainapod listeners for tuning in to this episode. And we hope that this discussion has taught you something new and inspired you to take action. Make sure to keep an eye out for upcoming exciting projects and events by Sustainapod. As always, We would love to hear from you about the episode. So let us know your questions and comments via Instagram at sustainapod_GIH or email at sustainapod@gmail.com. Thank you all for listening.